Welcome to Unit 4. In this unit, we will focus on religious art, and specifically the art of three religious traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. As always, you will be viewing a rather dizzying array of works, so now is a good time to step back just a little and consider some central themes that will emerge in this unit. One is religious narrative. The period we will cover in the next three units is from a largely pre-literate age. Most people will not have access to the written work, and the printing press is still waiting in the wings. The central narratives of a religious tradition were told orally or through art. You're already familiar with the Christian narrative, which, trust me, will be a great help. My guess is that you are less familiar with the central stories of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. So in these next lectures and accompanying videos, we're going to introduce you to these narratives. We have already talked about the special characteristics of sacred space, their exclusivity, abundance of material wealth and decoration, association with ritual and ceremony, and in many cases, location in a place of spiritual and/or political significance. In this unit, we will look at Hindu temples, Buddhist stupas and temples, and at Islamic mosques, and a tomb and a monument. Finally, all religious art contains iconography, symbols that serve as a kind of spiritual shorthand for both the narratives and the theological teachings of the religion. We're going to focus a great deal on iconography in our study of Hindu, Buddhist, and Islamic art, and much of it will be unfamiliar, so hang in there. The AP exam will usually have one long 30-minute cultural context question. The questions I'm about to show you come from the old version of the exam, but we're seeing similar questions with the new format. By the way, you will write your first long, that is 30-minute essay for this unit. The topic will be Buddhist works, and you will need to know how these works reflect both the beliefs and practices of Buddhism and the specific cultural context of individual works. Buddhism, as you'll soon learn, undergoes significant transformations as it moves from India into China and Southeast Asia. So here's a pretty typical example of a cultural context question involving religious art. Islam, as we'll learn, generally rejects the use of religious images, but the images of gods is ubiquitous in Hindu art, and images of the Buddha and various attendants appear after the first few centuries of Buddhism. Note that you need to be able not just to describe an image, but to relate that description to the religious beliefs and practices and discuss how the images reinforce those beliefs and practices. In other words, you need to look at content, function, and form in the specific context of each religion and how that religion is practiced in different parts of the world. So this was last year's students' long essay question. We will actually walk through the question at the end of the unit, looking at three sacred spaces: the Lakshmana Hindu temple, the Borobudur Buddhist temple, and the mosque at Edirne. Note that to answer this question, you would need to discuss visual and contextual evidence, and that you would need to know something about the beliefs and practices of all three religions. This is a question we made up to get practicing across the religious boundaries. So this question is not obviously religious, but as you'll soon see, the highly stylized figure of the Buddha and of Hindu gods could be used to answer this question. Again, much narrative art is religious art. In just a minute, we're going to be turning to the narrative of Siddhartha Gautama, or the Shakyamuni, the original Buddha, and also to some of the narratives of the Hindu tradition. Almost all of the major Buddhist and Hindu sites are also pilgrimage sites, and the same is true for the Islamic Kaaba and the Dome of the Rock, which are not mosques. How does the art and architecture of the sacred space reinforce the experience of pilgrims? Think about it. This question used to be a favorite. It hasn't shown up for the last few years. This could be the year. Well, now that I've made this unit sound alarming, I'm going to move on to Hinduism and Buddhism, and I hope allay some of that alarm. Our story begins in India, where both Hinduism and Buddhism originate. Initially, I planned to introduce Hinduism, explore Hindu art, and then move on to Buddhism. But Buddhism grew out of, and more accurately, grew in reaction to Hinduism, and Hinduism in turn evolved significantly after Buddhism swept through India, partly in response to the challenge that this new religion posed. So I've decided to spend the rest of today introducing both religions, alternating. It's going to be confusing at times. I'm going to rely heavily on videos, a nice break from the disembodied voice. Religion in India prior to the arrival of Buddhism and later Islam was dominated by the Brahmin or priestly class. Indian society was, and in many ways still is, divided into rigidly hierarchical castes with the Brahmin or priestly class on top. Religious practices consisted of elaborate rituals involving recital of the Vedas, the earliest Hindu sacred scriptures. Only Brahmins could perform these rituals. Much of Buddhism's original appeal was access to spiritual wisdom was granted to non-Brahmins. By the way, this photo of Vedic rituals was taken in 2011. This is not a tradition that has altogether disappeared. But Indian Buddhists did accept and indeed build on two other important elements of Hindu thought. In the West, we usually refer to samsara as reincarnation, the belief that how justly or unjustly one behaved in previous lives, that is, karma, determined status in this life. In the West, we tend to view reincarnation rather romantically, or at least favorably. My husband's Aunt Peggy once told me that even though she was a loyal Methodist, she really wanted to believe in reincarnation so that she had some hope of coming back to Earth as that most pampered of beings, a McConnell dog. She has a point. Let's turn to the first clip of a video about Hinduism, which describes some of these concepts in more detail. And with that introduction to Hinduism, I'm again rather confusingly going to switch over to Buddhism, and more specifically, the life of its founder, Siddhartha Gautama. A great deal of Buddhist art and iconography deals with this spiritual biography. Remember some of these details and you'll have lots of specific information to stick into an essay about a Buddhist work. After his long journey to enlightenment, Siddhartha Gautama gathered a group of followers and began to teach. This painting captures his first famous sermon at Sarnath. By the way, it's not a required work. This is called the Deer Park Sermon. Just as a hint of things to come, on the left we see a Buddhist stupa and on the right a Hindu temple. In his first sermon, Buddha laid out the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path to Nirvana. Remember, this is all about escaping the cycle of life. To do this, Buddhists recognize that life already brings suffering, that this suffering is produced by desire, and that they should strive to escape this dependence on desire by following a path toward wisdom. So you do not need to memorize the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path, but you should try to keep a general idea of these teachings. They can be summed up by what the Buddhists call mindfulness, or suppressing desire, controlling one's thoughts, and exploring truth through meditation and by practicing nonviolence and good works. This last little story in many ways illustrates these principles, which is why I included it. So, now that you've watched the video and know how the Buddha died, how does the manner of his death reflect the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path? He did not let the desire for life influence him. He did not allow evil thoughts to affect his view of the accidental poisoner, but instead worked for the good of others, both by forgiving the poisoner and by preventing others from being poisoned. Before we head back to Buddhism, let me make some brief comments about worldwide religious and philosophical movements at the axis or turning point of what we now call the Common Era. It used to be called AD, Anno Domini, Year of Our Lord. Not all historians buy into this notion, but the theory goes like this. Between approximately the birth of the Buddha and the death of Christ, new ways of thinking appeared in Persia, India, China, and the Greco-Roman world in a striking parallel development without any obvious direct cultural contact between all, at least, of the participating cultures. I recently listened to a lecture that explained this new way of thinking in a way that I at least found interesting and persuasive. The professor stated that most religions and philosophies before the axial age were concerned with what he called cosmic maintenance, keeping the gods satisfied and happy, and when possible, enlisting their help through offerings and sacrifices. What Buddha, Confucius, Socrates, Zarathustra, later Hebrew prophets and Jesus Christ offered was a philosophy and or theology based less on propitiating the gods, keeping them from being unhappy, and more on achieving personal transformation. How do we think more clearly? How do we live more justly? What is truth and how should we pursue it? We've seen how Buddhism challenged a religion based on sacrifices by a priestly caste, that's cosmic maintenance, with a religion or philosophy based on self-transformation through repression of desire, mindfulness, meditation, and good works. Now, Hinduism stepped up to the challenge of this so-called axial age. Buddhism spread rapidly, especially after it was adopted by the ruler of the Indian Mauryan dynasty, King Ashoka, in the 3rd century BCE. From there, it spread into Southeast Asia, China, and Japan, often with royal sponsorship. Stay tuned for days 3 and 4. Hinduism went into something of an eclipse, and then it underwent a kind of rebirth or renaissance during the Gupta Empire in the early centuries of the Common Era. One reason for this renaissance was that Hinduism moved away from an exclusive emphasis on priestly sacrifice toward a religion that focused more on personal transformation and the pursuit of justice, often sharpening the focus on concepts that were important to Buddhists, such as karma, or the fate arising from the justice of previous actions. This period also saw a new emphasis on a different set of gods, especially Shiva, Vishnu, and a goddess who took on several names and manifestations. So let's watch another clip from the Hinduism video, which talks about this transformation. As you've just learned, Hinduism has a vast pantheon of gods whom Hindus worship individually, but also see as part of a general godhead. In this sense, Hinduism is both a polytheistic multi-god and monotheistic one-god religion. Hinduism is also especially rich in dramatic, lively narratives. People with demons, monkeys, elephant-headed gods, snakes, so many great stories, and so little time left to tell them. To try to give you some idea of this colorful and complex world, and to introduce one of our required works, Shiva, Lord of the Dance, I'm going to close, or maybe open next class, with a children's cartoon introduction to Shiva.